Okay, good morning. All right, so it was a little bit complicated by Rav Stern's commentary yesterday, but the bottom line is that there is a shita that the Shach brings down that we saw yesterday, that as soon as the witnesses sign the contract, that's a method of transaction. That's a method of creating a transaction. And as long as both parties consent to create a lien on the debtor's property, even before the loan, they can legally do that as long as it's worded correctly in the shtar. It has to be said that it's me'achshav, that it is from this point forward. And even though the promissory note does not get into the hands of the creditor until a later date, so that the lien really doesn't start until the promissory note gets into his hands, but it works retroactively. That's the way that the commentary had explained what is going on over here. And so I think we were just looking at the last two sifkatans over here. Hamalva imo v'imsor hashtar liyad hamalva. He says, in a situation where the malva is present, then the witnesses certainly have a right, even if they don't see any money changing hands, they certainly have a right to generate a shtar and give it directly to the malva. Aval belav hachi ein kosvin v'chosmin afilu ra'u imra'u ha'idim shemasar hamalva hamos liyad halova. But he says, but if the witnesses simply witness alone, they don't have a right to just draw up a promissory note based on that. The ein hashtar kona ela misha shabal liyad hamalva o mishas kinyan suder imnasa az kidaleel v'nimsu shuhu toref lekuchos shelo kedin. The lo mishtabding nichsi halakuchos ad shas mesira sashtar lamalva v'ain lekamen sif yudches. So, in other words, there cannot be that the witnesses write up a promissory note unless the lova consents to it. The lova, the debtor, has to acknowledge that he is creating a lien on his property. The witnesses can't assume that that's what the lova wants, because as soon, and they also may, lova may actually want to create a lien later than the loan takes place, because let's say he needs to sell off certain properties. Let's say he says, I'm starting a business and I need to generate, first of all, some income from selling off some of my properties, but I'm still going to need a loan. So Shimon goes over to his friend Reuven and says, would you be prepared to lend me 100,000? I'm going to sell off my properties that'll yield for me $500,000, but I need another 100,000. And then Reuven says, sure. Witnesses see Reuven giving Shimon $100,000, but Shimon has not agreed that they should write a paper yet. Why? Because he doesn't want to encumber the $500,000 piece of real estate that he needs to sell, because he doesn't want a situation where if he defaults on the $100,000 loan, then the purchasers of the $500,000 piece of real estate are going to be on the hook because it was an encumbered property. So therefore, he arranges with Reuven, I will write you a promissory note, but it'll be dated after the date of giving me the 100,000. As long as both parties consent to that, that's fine. And that's why the witnesses can't assume that paper should be drawn up immediately unless they get instructions directly from the lova. Okay? Okay. The imsor hashtar liyad hamalva. But once they've gotten the consent, they can give the paper directly to the malva. Yesh omrim the im hamalva imo lifnei edem sulo chayshinan. The vadai yimserenu liyado miyad v'yesh cholchen v'chein sasam kana rav. He says as follows. He says, Lo yichtubim v'lova achi hamalva imo v'imser shtar liyad hamalva b'fneihem bo bayom. Ki shema lo yimserehu biyado ad lamachar verehu mukdam upasol. He says, the witnesses should only write up the shtar when the malva is present. And then they write it up for the lova, and then the lova has to give it into the hands of the malva in their presence on that day. He says, because if that's not what happens, and they write up a shtar without saying that it is occurring retroactively from the date of the writing of the shtar, so then the date in itself could be a faulty date because the lien does not begin until it reaches the hands of the malva. So therefore, as a general rule, and this is what the Imrei Yaakov is saying, is that as a general rule, when witnesses draw up a promissory note, they have to witness the deliverance of the promissory note into the hands of the creditor, since the lien does not begin until it gets into the hands of the creditor. And if they don't witness it getting into the hands of the creditor, then you have to be concerned that they may be creating a predated promissory note where the lien did not begin until a week later or whatever it was. Okay, let's go on to the next halacha. Now, I don't know why this starts off with an open parentheses, but this whole sif is bracketed, and I'm not really sure why. But maybe it's because it's really just a commentary and it's not teaching me a new halacha. So he says, "Vitam pisul hamukdam, ushema yitrof me'halakucha shelakchu miyad achar zman hakosav bishtar kodem shemas shulamalva." This is something that we've spoken out in the Imrei Yaakov, but the Rav Shulchan Aruch states it explicitly. He says the reason why you can't have a predated promissory note is because the promissory note creates a lien, and the lien, without any other indication, begins from the date that's written in the shtar. But since the lien doesn't halachically begin until the note reaches the hands of the malva, it could possibly create a situation where the creditor will seize assets from people who purchased the property legitimately when it was free and clear, because they purchased it before the promissory note was given to the creditor. And then it'll turn out that the creditor is seizing assets incorrectly. He never had the right to seize those assets that were sold off before he received the promissory note in hand. Since the encumberment did not take place until the malva received the note in hand. Lefichach shtar chov she'ein govin bo mimishubadim ein bo psul mukdam v'yicholim lekosvo lelova afal pi she'ein malva ima. But it's for that self-same reason that since the concern is when you predate a note, the concern is that it'll be used improperly to seize encumbered property. Let's say you draw up a promissory note that doesn't encumber any real estate. Okay, so let's look at a theoretical situation where a person draws up a promissory note, but he says, I hereby promise to pay you back the 100,000 that I borrowed from you. But, and there's a clause in the contract that says none of my real estate holdings are encumbered by this debt. Okay, if that is written explicitly in the contract, in the promissory note, so then it is okay to predate a note. It's okay to predate it because there's no harm, no foul. No one's going to be mistreated as a result of this note. That's right, exactly. And therefore, let's say the witnesses witness alone, and the malva is not present, and the lova says, do me a favor, draw up an IOU, that I owe the malva this money, but draw in it, write in it a clause that none of my property is encumbered, so then they can write it up even when the malva is not present. And so even though he doesn't take possession of the note until next week, and it's a predated note, there's no harm, no foul. An example of that would be, even if there's no clause explicitly in the promissory note, but another example would be, is that say witnesses do not sign the note, okay? Ela shechasam halo v'chasimas yada. But it's really just a simple IOU with the signature of the debtor, but there's no witnesses on the bottom. In that kind of promissory note, the property is not encumbered. I'm just wondering, in secular law, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if I write you an IOU and I just sign it and there's no witnesses, it's okay. Well, does it have any less legal standing than if there are witnesses? So if I give you that note, can you seize my real estate? So it's consistent with this halacha.
No, but if there were witnesses on that note, would that be secured property?
The only way you secure property is if you stipulate that this does secure my property.
Oh, interesting.
So it's not really.
So it is
Mortgage or, something like
right.
that.
So it is different from halacha. In halacha, you don't have to write explicitly that my real estate property is securing this debt. It happens automatically. As soon as witnesses sign it, so then that's implicit. Okay, it's interesting. So and there are times when you can have a promissory note that the debtor signs and then witnesses sign it, but they're not signing on the loan. They're signing that we saw this guy sign his signature. In other words, they have no knowledge of the actual loan that was made. They're just signing to say, we hereby witnessed this man signing this paper. And this is similar to promissory notes that are done in our countries. He's referring to Russia and Poland, Eastern Europe. If the witnesses are not signing that they were witness to the transaction, but they were just witness to the signature, so then that shtar, sort of like what Marvin is saying in secular law, that shtar can only seize chattel. It cannot, it can seize real estate as long as it's not encumbered. But once a person sells his property or otherwise encumbers it, the creditor cannot use this IOU to seize property that was already sold off to another party. Okay? So the witnesses have to be witness to the actual transactional event, whether it was a loan, a sale, or whatever it was. Okay, so let's go to the Imrei Yaakov, right? Tam Pisul Hamuktamu. He says the reason why you can't predate a promissory note or you can't draw up a contract unless it's in the presence of the creditor and you give it directly to him. He says, "V'kansuo so lifsol hashtar she'enu go ve'imo mimishubadim klal gam bizman shekvar nishta belo be'emes." He says, and it's important to know that if a promissory note is predated, what is the power of that promissory note? We said it's puzzle, but does that mean that a creditor cannot use it to collect his debt at all? The witnesses have clearly witnessed the loan. What if they predated the lien on the property because they drew it up after they saw the loan, but they did not witness the deliverance of the note to the hands of the creditor? And the lien doesn't start until it gets into the hands of the creditor. So the rabbis placed a knas, they placed a penalty on such a promissory note that it cannot collect from any encumbered property, even if the property was encumbered after the lien legally started, after the document came into the hands of the creditor. To give you, right, to disincentivize you from doing it. Aval mibnei chorin govinbo. But it at least is still a legal promissory note to collect from unencumbered property. In other words, it still works. You can still use it as a legal document to collect on a debt, provided that it's from property that's not currently encumbered. V'yesh omrim de pasol lagamri, but the Ramah goes even further, and he says, no, you can't collect with it at all. So it's a machlokas between the Mechaber and the Ramah. V'hainu hashtar, avol mikol makom lekuli alma gova mehalova kishumota shuchayev o kishiyesh edim bazeh. But that's only that the note cannot be used as an instrument of collection. But let's say, in addition to the promissory note, which we now have said is puzzle, let's say there are witnesses to the loan. Then I can bring the witnesses to Beis Din, and I can say, the Beis Din will say, well, Shimon has a good taina. He says the promissory note is puzzle. But yes, but the witnesses saw the loan. And then the Beis Din will accept the testimony of the witnesses. Now, loans made without promissory notes and only have witnesses can only collect, if I'm not mistaken, can only collect from, well, certainly only collect from unencumbered property. So the Beis Din would only be able to liquidate his assets provided that he hadn't sold them off, but they will never give a person in that scenario, creditor in that scenario, an opportunity to chase after property that had already been sold off. Okay. So we're worried that if we predate a shtar, the creditor will go after purchasers who bought the property before the lien started, but after the date that's written in the shtar. And that's going to be illegal. That's what I just said. And let's go on to the next halacha. L'kayim ha'inyan. However, when there is a shtar that is only written in order to substantiate the signature of the debtor, but not to substantiate the event that occurred, the loan that occurred. So then you're allowed to predate the shtar, because it doesn't matter what date is written on it. It's not going to negatively impact any third parties. Dimboim l'kaim ha'inyan, afalgav de'enu kasav b'lashon shtar, ela b'lashon moda ani, chasumata v'chasimas yadi dilamata toyid olai. He says in the parentheses, Dahainu she'enu maschil b'lashon b'fanenu edim chasumata. In other words, the promissory note is not written in the standard format in this kind of scenario. It doesn't say in the note that in our presence a loan was made from Ruvain to Shimon. Or let this document be a record of what we witnessed. Right? That's what you would normally write in a shtar, where the witnesses are giving teeth to the promissory note, right? Ela b'lashon moda ani chasumata. But rather it says, I, Shimon, hereby acknowledge that I owe $100,000 to Ruvain. And let this be my signature, let this be sort of corroborated by my signature below, or I hereby sign below. And the witnesses then sign below his signature saying, we hereby acknowledge that Shimon signed this document. If, however, the witnesses were to sign it and say, we are witnesses on the loan, and they sign their name below that, then that would be a legal promissory note, even if it's not written in the normal standard format. And also, if the deliverance of the shtar was not done in front of witnesses to the malva, he says, but let's say the witnesses don't sign the document, and it's a regular IOU, and it says, I, Shimon, hereby acknowledge that I owe Ruvain $100,000 that he lent to me on such and such a date. And he signs his name, signed Shimon. And then the witnesses don't sign the document. but they witness the transmission of the note from Shimon to Reuven. According to some poskim, that's what we call Eidei Mesira, right? And if you know the Gemara in Gittin, the very beginning of the Gemara in Gittin, the Gemara discusses that there are two types of witnesses on a get. There's Eidei Mesira and Eidei Chasima. The witness is either sign the divorce bill or the witness is to witness the transmission of the get from the husband to the wife. Okay? Which one enacts the severance of the marriage or the dissolution of the marriage? Well, the same thing is true in any other transaction. There is an opinion that says that Eidei Chasima Karsi, that even if witnesses do not sign on a note, if they witness the transfer of the note from the debtor to the creditor, then that promissory note can still be used to seize even encumbered property in a beis din. The Eidei Mesira Karsi Kidlael if Yud Imrei Yaakov the Maschel Hamalva Ayin Sham. And as we've explained before, Eidei Mesira witnesses to the transfer or the deliverance of the paper from one party to another does have substance in halacha. So a few other like chidushim that we've seen in this halacha. Number one is that you don't need to have a standard text in a promissory note as long as it's clear from the language that a loan was made and witnesses sign the bottom and say that we were witnesses to this transaction, to this loan. So then that piece of paper can be used to seize even from encumbered property. But if witnesses just sign an IOU, I, Shimon, hereby owe $100,000 to Reuven, signed on this day by Shimon, and the witnesses just signed below, and it doesn't say anywhere in the shtar that we were witnesses to this transaction. So then halachically, that's a malformed promissory note, and even though it can seize, you can collect with it, but you can't collect from encumbered property with that kind of shtar. Okay. Okay. So now let's take a look at one other thing. Okay. Likutin. Ishtabdu nechasav l'malva. That the property becomes a lien is placed on the property to the malva as a result of the deliverance of the shtar from lova to malva. Reuven shehiskim lahalvos mana l'Shimon. So he says in the following scenario, Reuven agrees that he's going to lend $100 to Shimon. Va'omer lo lech l'soifer v'la'edim sheyichdevu v'yachdevu sh'ateh chayev limana. And he instructs Shimon, go to a scribe and get Adam, have them write up on the promissory note that you owe me $100. And once you give it to me, I will give you the $100. Once you give me the promissory note, I will give you the money. And then Shimon goes ahead. He gets the promissory note drafted. He hires Marv Huberman to draw up the papers. Everything is legally binding now. And all that needs to be done is to actually get the cash. So, and remember, we learned in the previous halacha that you're allowed to draw up witnesses can draw up a promissory note in the absence of the malva, provided that they make sure that there's no predated event that's recorded here. They can just say, if it's possible for the lova to just generate a debt, even without receiving a loan. And if that's the way he writes it up, then it's legal. If afterwards Reuven wishes to change his mind, which is a jerky thing to do, but let's say he decides to change his mind. He says, I'm sorry, I've changed my mind and I'm not lending you the money. Or I'm sorry, listen, I just had bad news. My business is going belly up and I'm not able to lend you the money that I don't have it available anymore. Or for whatever reason. Reuven is under no obligation to follow through with the loan, even if witnesses saw him commit himself to lend the money to Shimon. Ve'afta yesh omim dekeven sheshimon kibel alav kinyan v'shibed al yezen nechasav l'Reuven avor sachamos sheduvar beinehem shuv eno yachol Reuven lachzor bo. However, even though there is such an opinion that once a kinyan was made in front of witnesses where Shimon basically committed a debt to Reuven. In other words, basically Shimon trusted Reuven. What Shimon did was he went over to Edom and said, make a kinyan with me on behalf of Reuven, that through this kinyan, I will owe Reuven $100 because I'm going to take this piece of paper with me and I'm going to take it to his house and he's going to give me $100 in exchange for it. So he asked me just to take care of it all before I bring it over to his house for his convenience. I then get to Reuven's house. He says, I'm sorry, I can't give you the money. Now, I've already generated a debt in front of witnesses to Reuven. So he says, there is such an opinion that because of that, Reuven does not have a right to go back on the deal. Mikol makom havesveika dedina, the kaven da hamalve muchzak, the mos, ef shalahot simimen. But it's a machlokas. And because it's a machlokas on how we paskin, and it's not clear whether Reuven is obligated to follow through on the loan, you can't force him to do it in Beis Din. He may not be a very nice guy. And we all remember, we learned at the very beginning of Imrei Yaakov, that a person who doesn't follow through on their word is what's called a mechusar amana, a person who acts in bad faith. Nonetheless, here we're dealing with, can I coerce him to follow through with the loan? Now, as far as the question as to whether I can coerce Reuven to follow through with the loan is only when Shimon made a kinyan with the witnesses to generate a debt. But in a situation where Shimon simply prepared a promissory note by hiring a scribe and having him print, or a lawyer and having him print up the promissory note and signing it without any kinyan that was made to generate the debt through that document, then everyone agrees that Reuven has a legal right to change his mind. However, who pays the costs of drafting that promissory note? If Shimon only drafted that promissory note based on Reuven's commitment to him that he would lend him the money, and then Reuven changes his mind, who has to pay for the drafting of the note? Reuven does. And that's going to be, when Marvin sends his bill to Shimon, he's going to say, he's going to be able to go to Beis Din and say, look at this outrageous bill that Marvin Huberman just sent me, and I now have to pay it, and I didn't get the loan. So this was money down the drain. I can take Reuven to Beis Din and force him to pay me back for the bill that I have to pay for Marv's services. Okay, so this is where we'll